1.5 years into Lula's presidential term, his economic agenda has seen some progress. But since day one, the government has contended with a deeply conservative Congress that's dominated by powerful rural lobbies and cohorts faithful to the far-right former President Jair Bolsonaro. Congressional leaders have also expressed their dissatisfaction with the people that the government has appointed to liaise with them, and that makes the issue even worse. Despite strategic moves to distribute cabinet positions to centre and centre-right parties, this hasn't guaranteed Lula a stable coalition, and some in the president's camp are calling for a complete reset in negotiations with Congress. But is that even possible? My name's Ewan Marshall, I'm Deputy Editor at the Brazilian Report, and this is Explaining Brazil. If you like Explaining Brazil, you should subscribe to our website, The Brazilian Report, which is the journalistic engine behind this podcast. Or you can go the extra mile and make a donation to our newsroom, tipping our journalists via our Buy Me a Coffee page. And you can also subscribe to our Buy Me a Coffee fan page, pledging a monthly contribution to our newsroom in exchange for exclusive content that you won't find anywhere else. Our Buy Me a Coffee subscribers are Wild Rice, Jaciara de Oliveira, Carson Allen, Gabriel Luca, Andrei Novoseltsev, Pan Ludwig, Leslie Seal, Mark Hillary, Louise Renz, Erwan Menais, Aaron Berger, Kars Vrieswick, Alistair Townsend, Miller Renacido, Peter Abramson, David Dixon, Jose Ozzy Stankovic, Emerging Market Muser, Anna Lund, Peter Suffren, Anderson da Silva, and someone who chose to remain anonymous. Now, before we go back to today's episode, we'd like to show you a little bit of our new series. This week, we're joined by columnist Beatriz, a political scientist, postdoctoral fellow at the University of São Paulo, and a researcher at the Pop Vox Foundation. Beatriz, thanks for being with us. So, we're 1.5 years into President Lula's third term. His first 2 stints in the presidency were characterised by a very positive relationship between the government and Congress, even if some may argue that that proximity was based on bribery, with the Mensalão scandal obviously being a case in point. But how do you see the relationship between this current Lula administration and the Conservative Congress?
I think the best answer to this question is to think that the minister, the person who is in charge of Congress relations, who is Alexandre Padilha, currently does not speak to House Speaker Arthur Lira. So the main person who is supposed to be making the bridge, who is supposed to be dialoguing with the chamber, with the House, which is the most problematic part of Congress, just because of the sheer size of it, doesn't speak to the person who sets the agenda and makes all the decisions. I think we're facing a number of problems in the relationship between the government and the legislative branch. And I don't see any movement from the government in terms of trying to address the problems or fixing or making changes, replacing ministers. I don't see any movement at all.
Even if there hasn't been dialogue between House leadership and the government, shouldn't things be smoother, especially in terms of some agenda points that are important for the government, like the environmental agenda, for instance? I mean, Lula was elected as part of a big tent coalition, and the government soon distributed cabinet positions to several parties with sizable benches in the House. So why hasn't any of that translated into congressional support?
Because I think people are still used to think about Congress as in the previous PT governments. Congress is not the same. And I'm talking about the institutional power and the ideological composition. We have a stronger Congress, and that is a product of many changes that started taking place in the mid 2000s. But also we have a Congress that tends to be more to the right? I don't like to say that it's a conservative Congress, because you and I know that there is a group of parties that we call the big center that are rentist parties. They are not necessarily programmatic. So I wouldn't be able to say that they are right to the right, but they tend to vote in most issues to the right. So we have these two difficulties. And what I see talking to people in Congress and talking to leaders and to legislators. It's just that the government is struggling, first of all, to accept that this is the case, and second, to develop a strategy to deal with it. And part of the problem also really is that President Lula himself is not involved in any negotiations with Congress. He used to do that in his previous administrations. He doesn't seem interested in dealing with legislators at all at this point.
And why do you think that's the case? Because Lula's considered to be, by many, perhaps the most skilled political negotiator in Brazil.
I think, first of all, this is a president who went to jail, who suffered a enjailment process that I don't even think we can say follow the rule of law from what we know from Vaza Jato. This is a president who could not go to his grandson's funeral while he was in prison. And he came back and ran. And he is seen by many political actors as the only one who could defeat former President Bolsonaro in the ballot. So part of me thinks that, first of all, he doesn't have people telling him or giving him advice that goes against what he thinks at this point. So the PT party elite that we used to have in the previous administrations that used to challenge Lula, that whole scene is gone. Partly because they were also in prison, but also because the party has a leadership problem, right? So there's nobody really talking to President Lula right now, except for the First Lady, Janja. But also, this is somebody who probably doesn't trust anybody after everything he went through. And this is my interpretation. I'm not sure that this is what's happening, but I feel like President Lula thinks that his job was to stop the extreme right from being reelected, and that job is done. The problem is that he's not delegating the governing part of the job to other people to do it.
And I mean, we've seen one of the leading figures of the Workers' Party, Senator Humberto Costa. We've seen him say that governments should carry out a cabinet reshuffle and only give cabinet positions to the parties that are actually supporting the government's agenda. I mean, at face value, that makes sense, but do you think that could create even more problems for the government, potentially making a tough congressional situation an impossible situation?
I think so. I don't agree with Senator Humberto Costa. I think that a lot of Congress people think that there should be the person doing the job that Alexandre Padilha is doing right now should be somebody who could actually talk to this big center and to the parties more to the right. It is Alexandre Padilha is a full Workers' Party person, right? He's a full PT leadership, and a lot of legislators have problems dealing with him. So there is that is part of the problem. But I don't also think that necessarily a cabinet reshuffle would change the status quo, because distributing positions on itself doesn't guarantee support, especially now with this Congress that is stronger. You have Eumar Nascimento, who is one of the candidates for House speakership next year. And he's one of the people who usually says that you have to see the cabinet distribution and the pork distribution, right? What we do through the earmarks, the budgetary amendments, they are not complementary. They are mutually exclusive, that you need to do both. And what we see when we look at the data is that the PT, the government, is still giving, executing, quote unquote, the earmarks related to the party Congress people, as opposed to the other parties who are part of the coalition. So you still have the same problem that you had in other PT governments, which is they are not very good in managing the legislative coalition. They give a lot of space to the Workers' Party, to the party itself, right? And not so much to the parties that are part of this coalition. And when you see this happening in the context that we are right now, with the Congress that is stronger and pans more to the right, you're going to see what they're facing, right? The struggles that they're facing. And there's something else I also wanted to add. When you look at the way that the government is dealing with Congress, what you often see is that you don't have a united front to deal with legislators. You often see that there are different people given different directions, and then legislators don't even know what the government position is in relation to a vote. So it's, from the outside, it kind of looks like a mess.
And also, the costs of being in the opposition are far lower than they used to be. And you've written about this for the Brazilian report, that this has a lot to do with the rise of budgetary grants, which have become costlier and also mandatory. So the government has lost this carrot to dangle in front of lawmakers whenever they wanted to push for an important vote. But even so, the government hasn't distributed these grants equally, right? It's benefited its own ranks mainly. And perhaps the Workers' Party isn't everyone's ideal partner.
I was thinking about that same question this weekend because I'm actually in the process of reading a book that has been just published, Why Hasn't Brazilian Democracy Died? By Carlos Pereira and Marcos Melo. And their argument is exactly that the argument in relation to the Dilma Rousseff impeachment is that the Workers' Party is not a good coalition partner to have. They're bad at managing coalitions, and the impeachment was a product of that. And I wonder to what extent this is preventable, because we have to keep in mind that the Workers' Party is the only party that is programmatic and that actually functions like a party in Brazil's political system. So if you're asking the only party that has a program or a resemblance of a program and that actually behaves like a party to not emphasize or to not use all of these resources, it's kind of hard to ask, right?
Sure, but one thing that many in the government's previous coalitions complained about was that whenever the government had a victory, it wouldn't necessarily be the cabinet minister from an allied party that would be featured in the evening news. It would be Lula. And whenever things went south, then the Workers' Party would leave its allies to scramble for answers and deal with the public scrutiny.
Yeah, I'm not saying this to say that the PT has no fault in this. I really do. And if you read what I've been writing, that's all I've been saying. I just wondered, I think that there is a part of it that it's just a function of the PT actually working as a party. And the other part of it is just the PT has a hegemonic characteristic to it, right? Which I think makes it very difficult for the party to survive or to behave well, not to survive, but to behave well in a fragmented multi-party system such as the one that we have in Brazil. I don't see the worst part of all this is that I don't see any hope for change in that regard. I really don't think you're talking about Lula appearing in the newspapers, taking all the credits for something that was good for the government. You don't even have that anymore. Lula's not even involved in the negotiations anymore. We're kind of, as I said, we're kind of looking at a mess situation. I think the government is waiting for the municipal elections in October to make some changes. But I worry that if Senator Humberto Costa is the voice of what's going on in terms of discussions within the party, I wonder if what they're going to do is just give more power to the PT. And that, to me, is a mistake.
But, I mean, municipal races often have their own dynamics compared with the national elections. What influence do you think that the local races would have in these dynamics between the government and Congress? And do you think the government should wait for the elections? Because, I mean, many parts of the economic agenda have passed, sure, but that's it. The environmental agenda, which is one of Lula's key selling points, that's been a bit of a disaster, hasn't it?
Right. I don't really think that the municipal elections have an influence directly. What it's going to tell the government and leaders in Congress is how strong is the left and how strong is the extreme right. That's information that as a political scientist, I want to know. After Lula's election, almost 2 years into his government, has the balance changed? If I was consulting for the government, I would have advised Lula to change Padilha a long time ago. I don't think they should be waiting for the municipal elections. I don't think that what we're going to get from it, changes the scenario in terms of who is doing the relationship with Congress. Padilha should have been removed a long time ago. But that's what the government, at least that's what we hear from the government, that they're waiting to see what the balance of power is in the country so that they can make the adjustments that they think are necessary. I don't know, if that's a good strategy. I don't think so.
And what would be the downside of this strategy? In other words, what are the real risks for the government here? Is it just the risk of being immobilized, or is there a more existential threat in this dynamic for the administration?
I think this is a very open question right now because we have a House speakership election in February. And to me, that's more important than the municipal elections for sure. I think a lot of the 2026 race is going to be like, we're going to start seeing paths towards that race in February next year. So I don't know what the risks are for the government. I don't know the extent to which the government is involved in the speakership election. Well, what I know is that Lula said that Lula would be able to veto his candidate. I don't know if that conversation moved on. We don't know. And I've been talking to people in Congress that don't give me the official party line. And even they are unsure about what the government's strategy is. So I don't know if the government is playing out these scenarios, right? If somebody is elected that is even, I don't think the government has a good relationship with Lula right now in anything that it's not economic policy. And even in economic policy, you've seen the government and Lula crashing, right? If somebody who is even more disaligned, does that make sense? With the government is elected, then the government has a real problem. If the government is able to, in the backstage, work towards the election and actually champion somebody who could help its agenda, then it's good news. But it's all going to depend on what's being done right now. This race is happening for at least a year. So I hope that the government is doing what it has to do. We don't expect that there would be a leftist House Speaker. That's impossible given the ideological composition of Congress. But I would expect the government to have an interest in having somebody who plays more to its side.
But I mean, there is an element of danger here, right? I mean, when the government tries to meddle in the House speakership race, it usually backfires. And Lula himself has a bad track record of doing that. What do you think? Do you think the government is interfering? How do you see that going?
What I don't think the government should do is try to launch its own candidate. That would be a huge mistake, as we've seen that in the past, right? It doesn't bode well to the PT, especially with the country in the state that it is. We know that we have a polarization process that it's basically society is divided between people who like the PT and people who hate the PT. So I don't think it would be smart for the government to do that. But I would expect the government to, at least in the backstage, get involved to avoid the election of somebody who would not work with its agenda. And to be fair, Gustavo, I don't even know who that candidate would be right now, right? I think we're going to see more and more of this race as we move out of the municipal elections. That's usually when they start putting platforms out, when the House starts getting like all these pamphlets and everything. And then I think we're going to see an actual declaration from all of the candidates in terms of what they intend to do as House speakers. But I know that there's some backstage work being done, and we don't know how much the government is involved so far.
And would you say that potentially the speakership election is more important than the municipal elections? I mean, for the political chess match in Brasilia.
I think that anybody who's paying attention to Brazilian politics right now should be very tuned into the House speakership election. I've been saying this, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that this is as important as the presidential election. So there are news articles every day in the newspapers, just with information from the race and who's supporting who or trying to support and who's like getting away from, like, you have to follow all these movements, especially if you want to understand executive legislative relationships right now.
Okay, Beatriz, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Beatriz is a political scientist, postdoctoral fellow at the University of São Paulo, a researcher at the Pop Vox Foundation, and a columnist at the Brazilian Report. If you like Explaining Brazil, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. Or better yet, subscribe to the Brazilian Report. the journalistic engine behind this podcast. We have a subscription-based business model, and your memberships fuel our journalism and keep us going and growing. And our work has been recognised for its quality. We've won several international awards. In April 2024, the Brazilian Report was named the best news website in the Americas for a small or local newsroom by the World Association of News Publishers, WANIFRA, and more recently, the Brazilian Report won the best story at the 2024 Digiday Media Awards for our story on the hacking attempt of one of Brazil's Supreme Court justices. And to continue doing this work, we need your support, so go to Brazilian.report. I'm Ewan Marshall, thanks for listening, and Explaining Brazil will be back next week.